It was a quiet summer night in 1991, the kind of night where everything feels safe, still, and normal. The kind of night where parents tuck their children into bed with a kiss on the forehead and never imagine it might be the last time. In a small town tucked away in the heart of America, 7-year-old Sarah Whitaker had just finished brushing her teeth, wearing her favorite pink nightgown with little cartoon stars printed all over it. She skipped into her bedroom, her beloved recording teddy bear clutched tightly to her chest, the one that said, "Good night, I love you," every time she squeezed its paw. Her mom, Anne, adjusted her blanket, smoothed her hair, and whispered, "Sleep tight, baby." Then she turned out the light. The house was silent, peaceful. A fan whirred in the corner. The sound of crickets echoed softly from the window left cracked open to let in the breeze. Nothing unusual, no strange car passing by, no thunder, no cries, just the stillness of a typical night in a quiet town where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Anne and her husband, Tom, settled into bed shortly after, unaware that this night was about to shatter their lives forever. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, a window of time so ordinary and quiet that no one even heard a whisper. Sarah vanished. When Anne woke up around 6:30 the next morning, the first thing she noticed was the eerie silence. Normally, Sarah would be bouncing into the kitchen by now, asking for cereal or talking to her teddy. But not today. The hallway felt too quiet, too still. Anne walked into her daughter's room, and instantly her heart dropped. The bed was empty. At first, she thought maybe Sarah had woken up early and gone into the living room to watch cartoons, or maybe she was playing hide and seek, like she sometimes did. But every room was empty. The front door was still locked. No sign of struggle, no notes, no toys moved out of place, just that teddy bear sitting on the bed, staring back with its stitched black eyes. Panic set in. She screamed for Tom. They searched every inch of the house, calling Sarah's name, looking in closets, under beds, behind the couch. But Sarah was nowhere. By 7:15 a.m., Anne was on the phone with 911, her voice trembling, heart pounding, barely able to breathe. My daughter is gone," she kept saying. Police arrived within minutes. First local officers, then state investigators. Dogs were brought in, searching for a scent trail. Helicopters scanned the woods. Neighbors were questioned, but nothing made sense. There were no broken locks, no footprints, no signs of forced entry. It was as if Sarah had simply evaporated. Word spread fast. A child had disappeared from her own bed. Media crews camped out in front of the Whitaker home. Volunteers flooded the area with flyers. Local stores posted her photo. The town came together, desperate to bring Sarah home. But as the hours dragged into days, and days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. There was no ransom note, no strange sightings, not a single trace of her. It was as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Anne refused to believe it. Every night she sat on the edge of Sarah's bed, holding the bear, praying. She would rock back and forth, whispering, "Come home, baby, Mommy's here." But Sarah never answered. That summer passed in a haze of grief. Tom became withdrawn. Anne barely ate. The house was frozen in time. Sarah's toothbrush still lay on the bathroom sink. Her school shoes still by the door. Her favorite cup, the one with the rainbow handle, never moved from the kitchen shelf. Her room remained untouched, like a shrine. The police followed every lead. A traveling handyman, a suspicious neighbor, even distant family members. All interviewed, all cleared. Nothing stuck. Nothing made sense. How does a little girl disappear from her own bed without anyone seeing or hearing a thing? It became the town's darkest mystery. Whispers grew, theories floated. Some believed she had been kidnapped by someone she knew. Others thought maybe she'd wandered off, but Anne refused to accept that. She wouldn't leave without her bear, she'd say, clutching it tightly. She never went anywhere without it. And that bear, that silly little recording toy, just sat there day after day collecting dust. No one thought much of it. No one pressed its paw anymore. It was just a relic of a happier time, a symbol of innocence now lost. But what no one knew, not Anne, not Tom, not even the investigators, was that the bear held a secret, and it would take 9 long years before anyone would hear what it had to say. Weeks turned into months, and the bright, colorful posters with Sarah's face slowly began to fade under the sun. Rain smudged the ink, time wore down the edges, and eventually some were quietly taken down. But not by Anne. Her posters stayed up, on her front window, in her car, even on her bedroom mirror. To her, Sarah wasn't gone, just missing, and missing meant there was still hope. But hope was a cruel thing. It woke her up every morning and kept her staring at the front door every night, praying for the sound of a little voice calling, "Mommy." Tom tried to be strong, tried to hold the family together. He returned to work, kept the lawn mowed, drove Anne to her therapy sessions. But behind closed doors, the silence was unbearable. Sometimes he'd open Sarah's closet just to smell her old sweaters. Sometimes he'd sit in the driveway for hours, afraid to go inside. The investigation dragged on. A dozen psychics reached out claiming visions, but none led to anything real. A woman in another state thought she spotted Sarah at a gas station, but the girl turned out to be someone else. Police followed every lead, no matter how far-fetched. At one point, they even dug up a patch of woods because a neighbor's dog kept barking near a tree stump. But again, nothing. Suspicion started to creep in. People began to whisper. Was it a stranger or someone close to the family? Friends who once hugged Anne in sympathy now looked at her with hesitant eyes. Even the police began asking hard questions. Where were you that night? Why didn't the dog bark? Did you leave the door unlocked? Anne answered them all, over and over. She cried, shouted, begged. I tucked her in myself. I kissed her good night. The house was locked. I would never hurt my baby. The media moved on. Another missing child. Another unsolved case. Reporters stopped calling. The search parties stopped gathering. Life around the Whitakers began to move forward, except inside their home, where time stood still. Anne couldn't let go. She couldn't bring herself to change a single thing in Sarah's room. Her bed stayed made, with the little stuffed animals all arranged just as she left them. Her bookshelf remained untouched, the bedtime stories still leaning in a crooked row, her clothes still neatly folded in drawers. Even her lunchbox, half packed from that morning in 1991, sat in the closet. The sandwich long gone, but the note inside still legible. Be brave. Love, Mom. The loneliness wrapped around Anne like a fog. Friends stopped calling. Family grew distant. She stopped going to church. She barely spoke to Tom anymore. Their marriage was cracking under the weight of shared grief they no longer knew how to carry together. Every now and then, Anne would sit on the floor of Sarah's room and just hold the teddy bear. It was old now, the fur worn thin, one eye hanging loose, but it still had that button on its paw, the one that let Sarah record messages. Anne pressed it a few times in the first few weeks after the disappearance, hoping to hear something, but all she ever got was static. Eventually, she stopped trying. Maybe the batteries were dead. Maybe it had been erased. Maybe it was just another dead end. But still, she kept the bear on Sarah's pillow, facing the door. Years went by. Tom suggested moving, a fresh start, somewhere quiet, where they wouldn't wake up every day to the sound of their own heartbreak echoing in the walls. Anne resisted, but finally, in the fall of 2000, she agreed. It wasn't healing. It was survival. As they began packing up the house, Anne found herself in Sarah's room one last time. It had been nearly a decade. She touched each item with trembling fingers, folding the clothes she never thought she'd touch again. The drawings taped to the wall, yellowed with age. The books, the lunchbox, the shoes, and then the bear. She picked it up slowly, cradling it against her chest. She hadn't heard its voice in years. It was silly, she thought, but something made her press that button. And that's when everything changed. At first, it was just static, a low crackle, the kind of noise you'd expect from old batteries or a worn-out speaker. Anne's thumb hovered over the bear's button, about to release it, when she heard something, faint, barely there, but unmistakably human. A voice. Her breath caught in her throat. She pressed the button again, this time harder, holding it down. "Help me! He's taking me! He said don't scream!" Anne's entire body went cold. The voice was quiet, muffled by static and time, but it was her daughter. Sarah's voice. The words were shaky, terrified, rushed, as if she had recorded them in secret, under duress. The room spun. Anne dropped the bear and stumbled backward, her heart hammering so loud she could barely hear anything else. She scooped the toy up again and ran into the hallway, screaming for Tom. Together, they replayed the recording, over and over, each time the same whispered message. "Help me! He's taking me!" He said, "Don't scream." 9 years. 9 years of silence, of cold leads, of hopeless nights. And now Sarah had left a message, a clue. It had been sitting in their house the entire time, hidden inside that toy. Waiting. Anne was called in several times to identify items. Sometimes it was a shirt, sometimes a necklace. Once it was a storybook. Goodnight Moon, the very copy she used to read to Sarah every night. The sight of it nearly dropped her to her knees. Her hands shook as she held it, the pages still faintly scented with the vanilla air freshener Sarah used to spray around her room. But still, no Sarah. Weeks passed, then months. The storm shelter had given up everything it could. No DNA of a second person, no clear indication of when Sarah had last been there. The notebook had stopped after a point. There were no exit signs, no goodbye messages, just silence. Again. Anne fought despair every single day. She returned to the toy bear often, pressing the worn button just to hear her daughter's voice. "Help me! He's taking me!" It was a knife through her soul every time, but also a lifeline, a reminder that Sarah had fought, that she had tried to leave breadcrumbs, that she had been clever, even in fear. Then came the breakthrough. A retired nurse in Mississippi called the tip line after watching a segment on national television. She remembered a young girl, about 9 or 10, who had come into the ER late one night back in 1994. The girl was accompanied by a man using the name Robert Miller, claiming she was his niece. The girl didn't speak much, but her eyes, the nurse remembered, were haunting. Not just scared, trained to be silent. The nurse had written a note in the hospital log that night. Child patient appears anxious. Possible signs of abuse. Guardian refused to answer questions. Police not called. At the time, it wasn't unusual for guardians to avoid questions. The child had only a minor wrist fracture. No one thought to push further. But the nurse had never forgotten that girl. Police pulled old hospital records. Though grainy and poorly stored, there was a security photo. It showed a young girl clinging to a man's arm. She had dark hair, and her face was partially turned, but Anne recognized her immediately. "That's Sarah," she whispered through tears. "That's my daughter." Michael Trent, a.k.a. Robert Miller, had slipped again, but now it proved something monumental. Sarah had been alive 3 years after her disappearance, and not just alive, publicly seen. That revelation sent the investigation into overdrive. FBI analysts began mapping out all possible locations Trent had been between 1991 and 1994. Then 1995, then 2000. It was like trying to follow the trail of smoke, but piece by piece, the patterns emerged. He never stayed in one place longer than 6 months, always near railroads, industrial towns, or truck stops, often just outside the radar, always just barely seen. In 1996, a waitress in Louisiana claimed to have served a man with a quiet teenage girl who barely touched her food. He paid in cash, tipped poorly, and the girl never looked up from her lap. No name, no conversation. But when shown a lineup, she too pointed to Trent. In 1998, an old train conductor remembered Trent from a seasonal job, said he once asked if he could stay in a decommissioned train car for a few nights. Alone, he claimed. But another worker later said he heard what sounded like a second person inside, a girl's voice, whispering. Each piece, individually, was not enough, but together they drew a line, a dark, winding road that stretched across states and years, and at the center of that road was one burning question: when did the trail go cold? Investigators began suspecting that Sarah had either escaped, died, or, worst of all, been handed off to someone else. This horrifying theory opened a new avenue: human trafficking. It was rare in the early 90s for trafficking to be part of abduction investigations, but now, with what they knew of Trent's behavior, it was plausible. Experts were brought in. Facial recognition was run across international databases, but Sarah's face had changed with time. If she was still alive, she might look nothing like the girl in the missing posters. Anne volunteered to make a national televised plea. The station set up lights in her living room, where the toys still sat untouched. She spoke directly into the camera, her voice cracking but firm. "Sarah, if you can hear this, if you're out there, I never stopped looking. I never gave up. You were always in my heart, always. I believe you're still alive, and I believe you're strong. You were strong enough to leave that message for me, remember? You found a way then. And if you can now, baby, find a way again. I'm still listening. I'll always be listening." The broadcast reached millions. Tips poured in from across the country. Most were dead ends, people mistaking strangers or recalling distant memories. But then, one call changed everything. A young woman in Colorado named Elise had recently aged out of foster care. She had no known birth records, no baby pictures, and had spent most of her childhood in group homes. But after watching Anne's broadcast, something in her stirred. A memory, a voice, a flash of a teddy bear with a button. She remembered pressing it again and again as a child. She called the tip line and agreed to a DNA test. Anne waited 6 days, 6 impossibly long days, barely sleeping, barely breathing. Then the call came. It was a match. The girl, Elise, was Sarah Whitaker, the girl who vanished from her bed in 1991, the girl who recorded a message in a toy, the girl who was hidden, moved, renamed, and forgotten. She was alive. The reunion was quiet, away from cameras and reporters. No big interviews, no media circus, just a mother and daughter in a room, staring at each other across a lifetime of pain and distance. Anne said nothing at first, neither did Sarah. They simply embraced and didn't let go. The investigation into how Sarah ended up in foster care after escaping Trent's control was complicated and murky. It appeared she had wandered into a police station in New Mexico in 2001, dazed, unable to explain her identity. She had been listed as a Jane Doe, claimed by no one. Trent had fled again, leaving her behind. With no memory of her real last name and trauma that blocked much of her past, she had been placed in the system under a new identity. But now, at last, she had a name. Sarah Whitaker had returned, not through luck, not through chance, but because of a toy, a plastic bear that carried her whisper across time, and because of a mother who never stopped pressing play. The story of Sarah Whitaker had come full circle, but its ending was not the neat, fairy tale closure people might expect. Reunions are rarely tidy when they come wrapped in trauma, silence, and lost years. For Anne and Sarah, the road forward wasn't paved with confetti or applause. It was lined with therapy sessions, long, tearful conversations, and the gradual process of rebuilding something neither had words for. In the first days after their reunion, Anne couldn't stop watching her daughter sleep. She would sit in the doorway, just as she had when Sarah was a toddler, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. Only this time, Sarah wasn't 3 years old in a pink nightgown with bunny ears. She was a young woman of 20, with scars behind her eyes and a quiet stillness that made Anne ache. And yet, she was still Sarah. The first time they sat down alone together, Anne brought out the toy bear, the one with the frayed button. She didn't press it. She simply held it in her hands, looking at it, then at Sarah. Sarah froze. Her eyes locked onto it. Her fingers trembled. And then she whispered, "I remember." The dam burst. They cried together for a long time, clutching that little toy. That single object, battered and sun-bleached, had carried Sarah's voice when nothing else could. It had been her signal, her cry for help, a whisper in the dark that refused to be forgotten. Anne finally pressed the button. The message played again. "Mom, please help me. He's taking me." Sarah closed her eyes. "I recorded it under my blanket. I knew you always told me that toys can hear your heart." Anne nodded, barely able to breathe. "I heard you, baby. I heard you." In the weeks that followed, Sarah began the delicate process of untangling memory from nightmare. With the help of trauma specialists, she began to piece together fragments, moments locked away by fear. She remembered train cars, motel rooms, a trailer in Arizona. She recalled being told to use a fake name, to keep her head down, to never talk to strangers. "He said you gave me away," Sarah admitted one day, her voice barely audible. Anne felt her heart crack. "I never stopped looking for you." "I know," Sarah whispered, tears streaking her cheeks. "I know that now." The world watched from a distance. News outlets begged for interviews. Publishers reached out for book deals. Documentary producers circled like hawks. But Anne declined them all. She didn't want their story to be spectacle. She didn't want Sarah to be another case file paraded on primetime TV. This was their life, and they needed time. But one thing Anne did do was create something unexpected, a foundation. It was called the Echo Bear Project. Named after the toy that carried Sarah's voice through the years, the organization was dedicated to helping families of missing children find hope, even in the darkest corners of silence. The foundation funded advanced forensic tools, promoted the use of audio toys and devices in abduction prevention, and, perhaps most importantly, created an anonymous survivors network where young adults could explore their past in a safe, supported environment. Within the first 6 months, 3 other young women came forward, questioning their origins after watching Sarah's story shared in a private survivor forum. One of them was confirmed through DNA to be a girl kidnapped from Iowa in 1992. Another was still undergoing identification. The third was reunited with a family in Oregon. Anne called the police that same night, barely able to form sentences through her sobs. Detectives arrived within hours. The toy was carefully taken into evidence, and forensic audio experts were brought in to analyze the recording. The toy was an older model from the late 80s. It used a simple cassette-like strip to record short sound bites. It had no digital memory, no overwriting protection, no encryption. But the voice was still there, buried under layers of static and time. When cleaned up by technicians, the message was clearer. They confirmed the voice belonged to a young girl, consistent with Sarah's age, and the emotional tone was consistent with someone in distress. And then came something no one had noticed before. In the background of the message, barely audible, was a distinct sound, a rhythmic clanging, then a distant horn. Investigators looped the cleaned-up audio dozens of times until one of them said it out loud. "That's a train." Not just any train, a very specific sound. The horn pattern wasn't standard. It was old, from a retired rail line that hadn't operated since the early 90s. The clanging, a crossing bell unique to a single maintenance yard used briefly in that same era. With this revelation, investigators reopened Sarah's case with fresh eyes. They combed through employment records of railway workers in the area. Focus shifted to anyone who had access to that maintenance yard, especially those who abruptly moved away after 1991. That's when they found him. Michael Trent, a 46-year-old man who had worked briefly as a yard technician in the summer of '91. He had no criminal record, nothing suspicious at the time, but shortly after Sarah disappeared, he sold his house and vanished from town, leaving no forwarding address. Back then, it hadn't seemed unusual. Lots of men came and went from seasonal rail jobs, but now, in light of the audio clue, Trent was no longer just a name on a list. He was a suspect. Police began digging. Trent had resurfaced under a different name in another state, living in a rural property with no neighbors for miles. He had never married, no children, a loner. When authorities arrived at his home, he was calm, too calm. They showed him a picture of Sarah. He claimed he didn't recognize her, claimed he had never even been to the town she vanished from. But inside his house, they found something he couldn't explain. Toys, old toys. Some were broken, some were dusty, but one in particular made Anne collapse when she saw it later. A red plastic hairbrush with tiny stars on the handle. It had Sarah's name scratched into the side in blocky, childish handwriting. It had been hers, one of the items that disappeared from her room that night. Suddenly, the case was no longer cold. It was on fire. A warrant was issued to search the rest of the property. Out back, past a line of overgrown hedges and down a sloped hill, police found an old storm shelter. The door was rusted shut. A padlock held it tight. When they finally broke it open, what they found inside changed everything. The rusted door creaked open with a groan, sending a cloud of dust and damp earth into the air. Flashlights pierced the darkness as officers stepped inside the storm shelter. The temperature dropped noticeably, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones, not just from the cold, but from the weight of something unnatural. The space was small and musty, the cement walls stained with age and silence. For a long moment, the only sound was the shifting of boots on dirt and the low, cautious breathing of the officers. Then someone whispered, "Oh my God." Along the far wall, lined in neat rows like an eerie time capsule, were the remnants of a child's life. A faded blanket, dolls, a small pink shoe, an empty juice box, the kind with a cartoon animal on the front. Everything coated in layers of dust and grime, but unmistakably out of place, and unmistakably deliberate. This wasn't just a forgotten shelter. It had been used. It had housed someone. A deeper search uncovered scratches on the walls, faint, uneven lines, like tally marks, hundreds of them, like someone had been counting the days. There was also something more horrifying, a heavy chain bolted to the floor, and at the end of it, a broken plastic cuff. Anne would later say she felt her heart stop when she saw the first crime scene photo, not because she didn't expect it, but because, for the first time, she had to confront a truth worse than her imagination had dared to form. Her daughter hadn't vanished. She'd been taken, and she'd been kept. For how long? They couldn't say for certain. Forensic experts believed the shelter hadn't been used in years, but the items, the brush, the toys, they weren't just planted. The dust patterns proved they had sat in place undisturbed for a long time. At one point, Sarah had been there. Michael Trent was arrested on the spot, but under questioning, he gave them nothing. No confession, no explanation. He refused to speak Sarah's name. He just stared at investigators, expressionless, as if daring them to prove something. It took weeks to build the timeline, but slowly, with every piece of evidence, a horrifying picture began to form. Sarah had been taken through her bedroom window. The screen was popped silently. A footprint had been left on the flower bed, missed during the initial search. Trent had known the layout of the neighborhood. He had been hired briefly by the city to repair sidewalk cracks and had worked only 2 blocks away from the Whitaker home that summer. According to records, Trent left town 3 days after Sarah disappeared. He sold his truck for cash. No goodbye, just gone. For years, he floated from town to town using fake names. No social media, no credit cards. He was a ghost. Back in the shelter, investigators found another chilling piece of evidence, a worn notebook, its pages barely held together. On the inside cover, scrawled in a child's handwriting, was a name, Sarah. The entries were heartbreaking, simple phrases. He says I can't talk today. I miss my mom. I heard a train again. Some pages had drawings, crude, shaky stick figures. One showed a girl with long hair holding hands, with another stick figure labeled Mom. Another showed a small house with no windows and a locked door. Then the pages stopped. The rest of the notebook was blank. Forensic dating confirmed the notebook entries were from the early 1990s, around the time Sarah vanished. There was no doubt she had been alive after her disappearance, alive and held captive. But the question everyone feared to ask was the one that haunted Anne every second. How long was she there? And where was she now? Trent wasn't talking, but the toy had already done what no human could. It cracked the case wide open. That old bear, that forgotten toy. Sarah had used it like a message in a bottle, a desperate cry in the only voice she had left. And now, finally, it had been heard. Investigators followed every trace. Cadaver dogs swept the property, soil samples were taken, nearby abandoned rail cars were examined. Every inch of Trent's world was searched, but Sarah was nowhere, and yet there was no body, no remains, nothing to prove she had died there, which meant maybe she was still alive. Anne clung to that thought like a life raft, even with the nightmares, even with the overwhelming horror of what had been discovered, even knowing that her daughter had suffered unimaginable things. She was alive until someone proved otherwise. The national media reignited with the story. Mother's old toy solves cold case. Headlines spread across the country. People sent letters, prayers, donations. But Anne didn't care about any of that. She just wanted Sarah, her real Sarah, not the girl in the missing posters, not the drawing aged by computers. The real child, who might be a teenager now, or even a young woman, who might have escaped, or been let go, or, worse, passed from one captor to another. As the investigation pressed on, the FBI created a full psychological profile of Trent. They discovered he had written strange journal entries in his own notebooks, filled with religious ramblings, paranoia, and fragmented sentences that made little sense. In one, he wrote, "She was my gift, my quiet world, but they always cry. They always want their mothers." Another said, "She learned not to speak. She stopped asking. Then she got clever." To Anne, that last line meant everything. Sarah hadn't given up. She hadn't accepted her fate. She'd fought. She'd recorded that message, a whisper in the darkness, because she believed someone someday would hear it. And someone did. A teddy bear, a forgotten voice, and a mother who never stopped listening. The discovery inside the storm shelter had shattered the illusions of peace in the quiet town. For nearly a decade, most had assumed that Sarah Whitaker's case would remain unsolved, another heartbreaking story filed away in cold case cabinets. But now, everything had changed. The toy had spoken. The shelter had screamed. And Anne Whitaker was no longer just a grieving mother. She was the heart of a resurrection, of truth, of justice, of hope. The media swarmed the neighborhood. Satellite vans lined the street like vultures. Reporters tried to get glimpses of Anne through her curtained windows, calling out her name as if she owed them answers. But Anne didn't care about headlines or sound bites. She was focused entirely on one thing. Was Sarah still alive? Investigators dug deeper into Michael Trent's past. They traced his jobs, his aliases, every bus ticket, every storage rental, every brief stay at sketchy motels. He had moved often, but always alone. He had no wife, no family, no consistent contact with anyone. His bank records were thin, his possessions minimal. He was the definition of a drifter, but one who carried dark secrets. Anne and Sarah had become more than mother and daughter. They had become symbols of something few dared to imagine in missing child cases: resilience. For Sarah, healing came slowly. She struggled with everyday things, trusting others, being alone in a room, the sudden sound of loud footsteps. She often woke from dreams that left her breathless and shaken. But she had something now that she hadn't in years: a center, a home, a mother who had never stopped waiting for her. And she wasn't alone anymore. Therapy helped, writing helped, music became her language. She started composing songs on the piano Anne had once considered selling during the worst financial years, but something told her to keep it. And now it became Sarah's voice. She wrote a piece called Whispers Through Time, a haunting, beautiful melody that began with the sound of a single high-pitched note, like a child's voice calling from afar. When she played it at the Foundation's first gala fundraiser, the room went completely still. Some cried openly, others just closed their eyes. Anne sat in the front row, her hand resting gently on the toy bear in her lap. When Sarah finished, she turned to the audience, paused, and said something simple. "I survived because someone listened." That message became the motto of the Echo Bear Project. I survived because someone listened. Over time, Sarah began sharing more of her story, not to the media, but to other survivors. She volunteered with foster youth, visited schools to talk about safety, and became a voice in legislative efforts to improve missing persons databases. Her strength didn't come from pretending nothing had happened, but from acknowledging everything that had and deciding it would not define her. One afternoon on a quiet Sunday, Anne and Sarah visited Sarah's old bedroom. It had been kept mostly untouched, a kind of shrine to a lost girl. Dust had settled on the dollhouse. The posters had faded. The curtains looked smaller somehow. Sarah walked in slowly, her fingers brushing the edges of her childhood. "I used to dream of this room," she said softly. Anne nodded. "It never felt right without you." Sarah picked up a small ceramic music box, one she had once gotten for her birthday. She opened it. The tinkling tune played. Her lip trembled. Then she turned to Anne. "Can we paint it?" she asked. "Whatever you want," Anne said. That evening they chose new colors, lavender and mint green. They bought paintbrushes and rollers. They opened the windows wide. They laughed when they spilled paint. And by sunset, the room no longer looked like a time capsule. It looked like a beginning. The bear, Sarah's Echo Bear, was placed on a new shelf, not hidden away, not stored in a box. It sat where light hit it in the morning, a reminder of what was lost and what was found. Today, years later, Sarah Whitaker is a name known not for the horror of her abduction, but for the power of her return. She continues to advocate for missing youth, for trauma recovery, and for the strength of mothers who never stop searching. Anne still listens to the recording sometimes, not out of sadness, but to remember the voice that refused to be silenced, to remember the miracle that began with one toy, one message, one mother who pressed play and heard the impossible. Because sometimes, even after years of silence, a whisper is all it takes to bring someone home.